Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Kahn. I'm founder at MCR Labs, and I want to first take a couple minutes and thank Alex and Melissa and all of our wonderful staff for organizing the event and for all of the collaboration that has really put together our second annual Cannabis Science Fair. So, welcome. The Science Fair is it's part of our Science Over Stigma campaign. It's something that we've been addressing and trying to make a real change in the cannabis industry and actually in society at large. Through the last several decades, we've been stuck in something I call a Schedule I paradox, where if a drug is classified as Schedule I, that means that the drug has no potential for medical use and high potential for abuse, right? There's no accepted medical use. And also that means that you can't study the drug. And how do you find medical use for a drug which you may not study? It's a paradox, right? And I want to really especially thank everybody who contributed to this science fair, because this is really our opportunity to break that cycle, to show, no, there is medical use. There it is. There is potential for more than just being continuously and forever stuck in that paradoxical cycle. So with that, I want to thank all of our presenters, everybody who took the time to come out to show support, everybody who's been putting in countless hours of hard work, dedicated research time. It's all, especially with research, you don't know how it's going to come out. Therefore, it may be it may seem useless sometimes, right? If the research doesn't go the way you want it, but that's why we do it. That's what research is. And with that, I want to introduce Dr. Staci Gruber, who has been involved in breaking this cycle longer than just about anybody in the country, right? In a good way. She's been fighting the right fight for a long time. We met about a decade ago at this point, right? Yeah, something like that. It's been incredible, and this is exactly what we need to try to move science forward in cannabis. So I want to thank you, and I want to introduce you to the Cannabis Science Fair.
I think that's just nice. Thank you. Let's see if I have no check problems. Oh, yeah, I would just stand in front of the big one. Better, yes. Hi, welcome. Everybody identify the emergency exits immediately. They may be in front of you or behind you. Take a moment now. I'm just kidding. So thank you so much for the introduction, Mike. It's incredibly kind and gracious of you, and it's a really fancy and very eloquent way of saying that I'm old, which I'm starting to embrace more recently. So, but really, truly, to all of you guys, the organizers of your second annual science fair, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I can't tell you how important it is to have data, science, actually drive the conversation, as opposed to rhetoric or, I don't know, thoughts, beliefs, I don't know. Let science guide you. So today, we'll spend a little bit of time with what I like to call what to keep in mind, and you'll understand that in a minute. Recreational versus medical cannabis. Not really versus, but I'm gonna make some comparisons. And again, as I don't have to explain to this audience, you're all here because you're invested in either learning about or you're already doing something related to cannabis, right? Good, smart. Cannabis has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's not new. I love when people come up to me and they go, "Oh, such a good move, this new cannabis thing." Well, not so much, right? So cannabis has been around for thousands of years, and it was part of our U.S. pharmacopoeia, actually, in 1850, which meant that doctors could and did prescribe cannabis. It wasn't a certification or recommendation for use. It was a prescription for various and sundry indications and conditions and symptoms. Just keep that part, quote, in mind as we move through. But, I mean, as recently as yesterday, President Biden signed a research initiative, a bill to expand research. So we have news headlines every day, legalization efforts. We certainly have evidence about rapidly expanding cannabis and hemp industry activities and ideas for potential clinical applications. That's where I spend most of my time. And of course, concerns related to mitigating risk and harm, because with cannabis, it's not one size fits all and it's not one thing for everybody. When we say cannabis, though, we typically mean many things. We have this one word, cannabis, or marijuana, depending on who you are and where you're from. And we use it to describe almost anything that comes from the plant, cannabis sativa L. And that, to me, is a little bit of a problem. I can't tell you how many people come up to me and they say, blah, 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 well, you know, cannabis, and what they really mean is THC. So just to be clear, and this may be sort of a walk down a very familiar path for most of you, there are over 400 known compounds in the plant, 400. 100 or more of these are what we call phytocannabinoids, chemicals in the plant that interact with the endocannabinoid system, a system of chemicals and receptors throughout the brain and body. That's important to keep in mind because we have these two main players. And if you ask some people, they'll tell you, I know all about cannabis and that THC. Because it's just the one, sort of the one note, Johnny, right? But it's not true. So delta-9 THC is the primary intoxicating constituent of the plant. Very often it's what our recreational consumers or our adult users are looking for to change their current state of being or to be high. I live in a judgment-free zone, by the way. I spent decades with recreational consumers. Nobody ever wants to hear about your cannabis use more than me. Never. But we assign no judgment to it. But there's a huge difference, oh, that's fun, between that and something like cannabidiol, which is a, but not the only, non-intoxicating constituent of the plant, often touted for its therapeutic benefits. There are also dozens of what we call the minors, additional cannabinoids. They may be minor with regard to how much is natively in the plant, but they have their own biobehavioral effects, so I often call them major players. It's also terpenoids, the essential oils that give cannabis its characteristic scent and flavor profile. Neither CBD nor THC have a scent or flavor. That shocks a lot of people. But suffice it to say, it's complex, miraculously, beautifully complex, but it's not one thing. Hemp is a variety of cannabis. Basically, if you have less than 0.3% THC by weight, you're classified as hemp. And in this country, that's the source of the majority of products that we see proliferating in the marketplace that are usually touted as high CBD-containing compounds. But just as much as cannabis is complex, so too are the products derived from or perhaps created to be similar to. So in terms of products, you can have plant-derived or non-plant-derived. Plant-derived products can be either full spectrum or broad spectrum. Full spectrum means they're going to contain all the cannabinoids, terpenoids, flavonoids, things that are natively found in that chemovar, in that plant. Broad spectrum, by comparison, should have no quantifiable amount of THC. You can ask Mike. It's really hard to get there, by the way. Level of detection is different from level of quantification, but a different story for a different day. The point is, for people who cannot or should not be exposed to THC for a number of reasons, typically those are the products that those people are more interested in looking for because ostensibly they will not necessarily test positive on a urine assay. You can also have a plant-derived isolate, a single extracted, often purified compound like Epidiolex, the only FDA plant-derived cannabinoid-based medicine approved for use for primarily pediatric onset and tractable seizure disordered kids. You can also have non-plant-derived isolates, so laboratory-created analogs, if you will, of things like THC, so dronabinol or nabilone. So it's complicated, right? You're getting the point. It's complicated. I often hear people ask the question, well, what's the difference? I mean, the molecule is the molecule is the molecule. I couldn't disagree more vehemently. No, 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 no. Single extracted purified compounds look very different from broad or full spectrum products, and that's because of something that we call the entourage effect, which is basically the synergistic action that occurs in the presence of multiple cannabinoids and also terpenoids, flavonoids, etc. It's the 1 + 1 = 7 phenomenon. Bigger bang for your buck, think of it that way. That's probably the best way to put it. If you take nothing else away from this today, I want to impress upon you that medical and recreational cannabis use are not the same. The reason that that's such an important distinction to make is because of the long-held beliefs that people have about recreational or adult cannabis use, okay? We'll talk about that really briefly as primarily a comparison. So the goals of use are very different for recreational consumers and medical patients. Our recreational consumers, and again, no judgment here. This is how we spend our time, listening to people who say, yeah, I'm looking to change my current state of being. I want to be a little high. No harm, no foul. Very different from my medical patients who look at me and say, Dr. Gruber, I can't be high. I don't want to be high. I just want to sleep through the night. I want to take a walk with my husband. I want to remember why I went to the store. That's what I'm looking for. I don't want to be high. As a result, the products that they choose are very different with regard to their constituent profiles. The quote, what's in your weed factor, something else Mike and I like to talk about. What's in your weed in terms of the constituents? Our recreational or adult users are typically looking for products high in THC. That's the goal, right? If delta-9 THC is the primary intoxicating constituent, you can see why that's the goal. In fact, most products these days have almost undetectable amounts of CBD, which in previous studies has been shown to mitigate or reduce some of the, let's just call them less desirable effects of THC. We won't even call them negative. On the other side, our medical cannabis patients may choose products high in THC, but they're often choosing products high in other non-intoxicating cannabinoids like CBD. Age of onset, very, very important for my comparisons, also very different. Typically in adolescents or emerging adults, usually when we see recreational use beginning, our medical cannabis patients are almost always over 25. They're often middle-aged or older adults. They usually don't come to cannabis as a first-line therapy for exactly the reasons Mike was just talking about. Very important also take-home message. Most of what we know about cannabis comes from studies of recreational consumers. Recreational consumers, primarily young, healthy recreational consumers. That is true despite the fact that the United States re-legalized cannabis for medical use in 1996. California, 1996, we have no long-term studies of the impact of medical cannabis use. We're starting to, and I'll get to that in a minute. But almost everything we know about cannabis comes from studies of recreational use. Just keep that in your mind for a minute, right? In general, certainly not always the case, but in general, these studies, not just from my lab, or my colleagues in the United States, but across the globe. In general, what we see are reports that compared to those who don't use cannabis at all, those who are using cannabis regularly or with a consistent pattern of use, have documented poorer cognitive performance on tasks requiring things like memory or attention, executive function, tasks mediated by the frontal part of your brain, right behind your eyebrows. Last to come online and sadly first to go, by the way, as we age. It's very sad. Biology is cruel. That example of the bars, if you look at that, I don't have my little pointer, but you can see it. The blue bar are people who don't use cannabis at all. The minty green bar are early onset cannabis users. These are recreational folks. And the dark green bar are later onset recreational users. What do I mean by early onset? Regular pattern of consistent use before the age of 16. You don't even have to know what that cognitive task is to see that the early onset folks are statistically significantly, quote, worse in terms of a low bar. It's actually something called the Stroop interference condition. They perform significantly more poorly on the task relative to both non-users and later onset users. Very often what we see are recreational consumers look different from people who don't use at all. And when we split the users into those with early and late onset, that's when the differences really become clear. This is also true when we look at patterns of brain activation using things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, and even in studies of brain structure, when we look at things like white matter microstructural integrity. Something called diffusion tensor imaging allows us to look at white matter, which I'll show you in just a minute. Same kind of thing though, look at that bar graph. Again, blue is non-users, the green is early onset, dark green is later onset. The only statistical significance you see is between non-users and early onset folks. So if you don't look carefully enough at your sample and split them, you might miss the story. In general, earlier onset of use, this is what our decades of work in this area has basically resulted in us reporting. Earlier onset of use, as well as higher magnitude and frequency of use in the recreational consumers, is generally associated with more pronounced changes. It's true cognitively, it's true in terms of patterns of activation and measures of brain structure. Generally, that's because of what we believe to be a greater overall exposure to delta-9 THC, while the brain is neurodevelopmentally vulnerable. As I mentioned, when we're adolescents, we're, quote, half-baked, if you will. I can say that because it's a cannabis audience. So the brain develops from the back to the front, bottom to the top. Last part to become fully developed is the frontal cortex. It's not just sensitive to cannabis, it's sensitive to other substances, to alcohol, to illness, to injury. It's just sensitive. It's not exclusive to cannabis exposure, but the brain is vulnerable. That's the point. So it raises the question, this is the important part, what about adults using cannabis for medical purposes? Would we see the same outcomes as young recreational users? That's my grandmother. It's not really. May she rest in peace. It really isn't. But she was very invested in getting to the bottom of why people had such issues with individuals questioning whether or not adults would or wouldn't look the same as young recreational consumers. So despite the fact that cannabis was re-legalized in '96 in California for medical purposes, we have no studies of long-term impact of medical cannabis use. So in 2014, I launched MIND, Marijuana Investigations for Neuroscientific Discovery, a program dedicated to looking at the long-term impact of medical cannabis use on things like cognitive performance, clinical state, conventional medication use and how that may change over time, quality of life, sleep, where we can, measures of brain structure and function, and related measures. That's a catch term for basically anything I can think of, okay? The program uses longitudinal, observational, cross-sectional survey, and finally, clinical trial models to support a number of projects that are designed to look at the impact of both commercially available and custom formulated products that are basically intended to be developed to address a range of indications and conditions. The goal ultimately is to harness the therapeutic potential while minimizing potential risk and harm associated with cannabis. So the program's home to a lot of firsts. It's the first ever longitudinal study of medical cannabis patients. By the way, that gives me no joy. It shouldn't be the only one still. There should be more people doing this. It's also the first to track cognition as a primary variable. I couldn't believe this. When I scoured the literature, I found a few examples here and there about people who had asked questions regarding cognitive performance using individual items. We need a comprehensive assessment. People want to know what's going to happen to their brain over time. This is important. It's also the first ever to use neuroimaging. And finally, we have a number of INDs, or investigational new drug approvals, for a range of clinical trials designed to look at different types of anxiety in a number of populations, as well as pain, and in patients with glioblastoma and bipolar disorder. We've also created a number of novel tools to better assess things like actual exposure to individual cannabinoids, as opposed to, quote, guesstimating, I don't know, maybe this much? Yeah, not helpful. And we actually built a driving simulator in my lab to be able to understand the potential impact of the residual exposure, residual impact of cannabis post-exposure, not acutely intoxicated. So I'm going to show you some data from our first observational study, which is still going, that, as I mentioned, is designed to look at all of these outcome measures, things like cognition, mood, conventional medication use, quality of life, et cetera, in individuals before they begin using cannabis for medical purposes. That's really important. So these people are not already using when we have them come into the lab for the first time. We follow them for what is now up to 3 years. It was 2 years, and I was told I'd never get anybody past 3 months. That didn't happen. We see them, again, in person and sometimes virtually. Baseline, 3, 6, 12, 18, I think 15, 18, 24, 30, and 36 months now. And they do monthly phone check-ins with my team. They can use any medical cannabis products they want for any various indication that they have. Actually, to get into the study, they either have to have a certification for use or express an interest in using hemp-derived products. That was designed to prevent people from, quote, just coming in to use cannabis legally, which, again, we just haven't seen at all. And at each one of these visits, they complete pretty comprehensive assessments of things like clinical state, medical cannabis use, conventional medication use, cognitive performance, and neuroimaging. Once our folks settle on a regimen of cannabis, we do have their products assessed by an outside lab so that we don't have to wonder. I'm going to show you data on about 67 folks who have completed a baseline and at least one follow-up visit. In general, these are people well into, well, I shouldn't say well into, let's just say they're mid-40s. Let's not put a title on it because the government has now decided that older adults start at age 50. Yikes, just saying. These are pretty well-educated people, just under 120 with IQ, and pretty well-educated at 16 years of education. Duration of cannabis abstinence. So remember I said when they come in, they can't be using, they all have to be negative. However, some have had past histories of cannabis use, as you might imagine. So the length of abstinence that we're looking at here is over 20 years. Minimum period of abstinence to get into the study is 1 year. What are they using for? Anxiety and PTSD, pain, sleep, mood, attention, and potentially other. What's other? Inflammatory bowel disease, chronic migraine. If you look on the right side, you see that THC and CBD exposure graph, and what you see at 3, 6, and 12 months is that overwhelmingly this population is being exposed to more CBD than THC. Just saying. So for all the people who said, oh no, they're all looking to just get high, blah, blah, we don't see that. I love to prove people wrong. We also have a group of treatment as usual patients who have similar indications and conditions as the medical cannabis patients, but who have elected not to use medical cannabis. One quick fun fact, it's hard to keep those people in because they continue to convert from treatment as usual to medical cannabis patients over time. So the first thing I'm focused on is that conventional medication use. Given the opioid crisis, of course, it's important to examine the potential role of cannabinoids, especially since many patients who use opioids don't get full benefit, they don't get full symptom relief, and they often talk about and complain of side effects associated with opioid use. Interestingly, states with legalized medical cannabis programs have reported fewer prescriptions for opioids written and fewer overdoses, but that data was called into question. I think it was 2019, and they basically called for a need, they underscored the need for greater individual level data. I present to you individual level data. In our study, what we see are medical cannabis patients reporting notable decreases in their use of conventional medications after 3 months of treatment, a 41% reduction in the use of opioids, 28% reduction in over-the-counter pain relievers or analgesics, and 37% reduction in the use of benzodiazepines. Remember, I'm not asking them to cut down on conventional medications. These are people using their own products, their own way for their own symptoms. They're doing it on their own. We're just asking them about their use. We see further reductions at 6 months and 12 months. So we have a number of publications from the program which were tough initially. Mike probably remembers way back when. In 2016, we published our first pilot study. The publishers actually asked me to get at least 10 patients through baseline and 3 months of treatment. I think we published on 11. Yay. We then followed that up with a much more expanded study and followed patients over the course of a year. I'm going to show you some of that data and compare it to what we know about in general. In general, previous studies have demonstrated that medical cannabis could be effective at alleviating mood-related symptoms. We did an early case study in '96 suggesting that some patients reported successful improvement of mood after using cannabis. In 2016, we launched our pilot data, and then we expanded that in 2021, following people over the course of 1 year. And what do you know? We see clinical improvements. If you look at the top, that's the profile of mood state total mood disturbance score that changes rather dramatically from baseline over the course of 12 months. We see the same thing in something called the Beck Depression Inventory, a very, very common self-reported measure of depressive symptoms by patients. Again, these folks are going from, it's hard for me to read, about a 12.7 to under 7. So that's pretty staggering. You do not see the same change in treatment as usual patients. In terms of anxiety, we certainly know that medical cannabis has been hypothesized to be helpful for those suffering with anxiety. Quick fun fact, in case you don't know, THC has bidirectional effects. You heard it here. Low doses can be anxiolytic, that is, they could help you, but higher doses may not be your friend. They may be anxiogenic or make things a whole lot worse, just to be mindful. There are a number of studies, including a recent clinical trial out of Japan, suggesting that CBD is an effective anxiolytic, and we'll get to some of our own data shortly. But just looking at our observational study, again, these are people using their own products over time, statistically significant reductions in measures of anxiety between baseline and over the course of 12 months of treatment that we don't see in the treatment as usual, folks. Pretty striking. In terms of sleep, there have also been some suggestions that cannabis could be helpful for sleep. Sleep is often considered a secondary or tertiary measure. Almost nobody looks at it as a primary variable. I think that's interesting because think about it for a second. Whether you have chronic pain or anxiety or PTSD, almost every case sleep is disrupted. I'm not sure why we don't move this to the top of the chain and start. Well, we are. But it's really interesting because we certainly see precipitous increases early on in treatment. So we see a statistically significant improvement in sleep quality between baseline and 3 months that continues over the course of the year that we do not see in treatment as usual patients. Quality of life I won't spend much time on. Generally, we have reports in the literature from folks living with chronic pain who say that medical cannabis can be helpful for any number of different subtypes of pain. Pain isn't one thing, lots of different subtypes. And that's important to keep in mind. And we certainly see some improvements over the course of a year in terms of psychological health and physical health in our patients that we don't see in the treatment as usual, folks. But let me turn to cognition quickly because I'm mindful of time. And I think, I don't know when we started, but I don't want to keep people terribly long. But this is important because, as I mentioned, there have been dozens of studies that have looked at the impact of recreational cannabis use, right, on cognitive performance, generally reporting poorer performance in our chronic recreational consumers. But given these inherent differences that I pointed out early on between recreational and medical users, the question was whether or not we'd see the same decrements. And I was told early on it would be the same pattern. But there have been very few studies, really none until ours, that have looked at the impact of medical cannabis. And often, again, cognition is deemed a secondary or tertiary measure, and people use self-report scales as opposed to a comprehensive neurocognitive battery. So this is just an example of some of the measures that we give, either in person or since the pandemic, which was really not any clinical researcher's friend. We now have ways of administering these things remotely, not nearly as fun, that's for sure. But I would just draw your attention to that top one again, that Stroop color word test. Basically, that's the interference condition where you have to inhibit the overlearned response tendency of reading and instead name the color of the ink. Sounds super easy until someone's standing in front of you or sitting in front of you with a stopwatch, by the way. Not so easy. Trail making. B, people are alternating connecting dots, number and letter. They have to alternate. Wisconsin cart sort is a way for individuals to demonstrate that they pick up on a changing rule strategy. Letter number sequencing. Imagine somebody gives you a string of numbers and letters as a jumble, and you have to repeat them in order, numbers first, then letters. And phonemic fluency. I'll give you a letter. Tell me all the words that you can think of that begin with that letter. What we see is interesting. Again, remember what we see in our recreational consumers. Decrement, secondary to cannabis exposure. We don't see that. We do see some improvement over time, and actually, we're starting to see the same pattern in some of the treatment as usual people, suggesting that for some of these things, there's some habituation or practice, despite the fact that we're using alternate versions. But interestingly, in the MC group, we're not seeing decrements. Not at all. We're seeing improvements over time. The treatment as usual people are showing some improvements, but not nearly to the same extent as the medical cannabis people. That's also true when we get to the letter number sequencing, especially, where we see improvements in our medical cannabis patients and actually decrements in the treatment as usual people, same for phonemic fluency. So not the same pattern. Again, I think it's important, let science guide you. Let the data tell your story. I'm going to shift to some neuroimaging data, and I won't go through the fMRI data, but I will show you data from a paper that we just published, I think about 2 weeks ago. I mentioned diffusion tensor imaging. This is your brain's white matter fiber tract integrity, right? So white matter connects brain region to brain region. I'm just going to go back so you can see that, because that's your brain's white matter. Sort of like, that's like RT, but this one works, right? Just kidding. So diffusion tensor imaging allows us to look at organization and coherence of white matter fiber tracts. Again, white matter connects brain region to brain region for good, clean communication. Numbers for something called fractional anisotropy range from 0 to 1. Higher numbers are better. That's what we want. And just as a quick example, I pulled this from a 2014 paper I published, so a long time ago. This is an FA, or fractional anisotropy, again, measure of white matter integrity, map that basically shows the differences between non-users and recreational consumers. Every place you see yellow, there's a statistically significant difference between recreational cannabis users and non-users. I'm going to put it in a bar graph because it's easier. Once again, early onset people have statistically significantly lower white matter fiber tract integrity compared to non-users. Later onset users don't show much. So that's important. Keep that in mind. What about our medical cannabis patients? So if you're a neuroimager, you throw everything you can at your people once they're in the scanner because it's pretty expensive. So you may as well do it. You don't necessarily expect this. So the white bar is baseline. The minty green bar is 3 months, and the dark green bar is 6 months. That's our medical cannabis patient group, and what you see is medical cannabis patients actually showing increased white matter organization over the course of treatment. Increased, not decreased. It's the other way. The other way. Treatment as usual patients not only don't show that, in some cases it's a little bit more variable, but these results suggest that medical cannabis may actually be related to a structural brain change. That's really striking. Again, this is increased white matter fiber tract integrity, not decreased. People often ask about medical cannabis and chronic pain. We published a paper, I think it was 2021, focused on a group of patients only using for chronic pain because THC and CBD have both been implicated in anti-inflammatory processes and pain relief. There was a 2017 paper by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine demonstrating there was, quote, conclusive or substantial evidence for cannabis being effective for pain. Most investigations, though, that have looked at pain are using retrospective surveys in patients or acute administration paradigms. So they will inflict pain, which is super fun, by the way. Sign up right away. Don't hesitate. Especially if you're a person who doesn't even have chronic pain. So you take a healthy person and you give them a task that causes pain. I mean, that's the same as somebody with chronic pain, right? Probably not. Not to disparage any of the previous work, because it's incredibly important. Please don't misunderstand my humor. It's important. Not the same as looking at patients with chronic pain over the course of time, which is what this data represents. Over the course of 3 to 6 months of treatment with, again, products of their own choosing, our patients with chronic pain report significant decreases in their ratings of pain on the numeric rating scale, pain distress scale, and pain disability index. That blue line, once again, treatment as usual. We don't see the same thing. Finally, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but a lot of people were very concerned about cannabis use disorder. So we hear a lot about this in the news, right? Cannabis use disorder, or rates of cannabis use disorder, vary very widely in the literature. It goes anywhere from like 4 or 5% to 30% or north. Wow, that's a big range. And so the question is, what would we see? You know, we assess cannabis use disorder in recreational folks all the time. But no studies thus far have really exhausted this at all, or examined this, not exhausted, examined this in medical cannabis patients. Something called the Cannabis Use Disorders Identification Test is used pretty frequently as a screening tool. We use it in our rec studies, and we added it to all of our medical studies. By the way, the only way to actually diagnose cannabis use disorder, just in case anybody's wondering, is to use DSM-5 criteria, like use a structured clinical interview, like we do, you know, in the very beginning when people enter our studies. That's the way you do it. This is a screening tool, and it's helpful in recreational folks. The study that we did was actually designed to both look at potential misuse among medical cannabis patients and to determine whether or not the scale was actually valid. Fun fact, if you look at that data at baseline over the course of 12 months, if hazardous use begins at a score of about 8 and possible CUD starts at 13, you can see the numbers don't even get to hazardous. We took a closer look because the numbers are clearly going up over time, right? Like, you know, scores are increasing. But when you break down this 8-item measure, question by question, you see why. So frequency. If you use cannabis every day, you start life on this scale with a 4. So there you go. People often identify as medical cannabis patients and use their products every day. Probably not shocking. So we also looked at the validity of the scale. Cronbach's alpha for this was remarkably low, suggesting it's not valid in medical cannabis patients. So we're trying very hard to develop one that will be. So really important. So let me just summarize this data before I show you some interesting new data. Between 3 to 12 months of medical cannabis treatment, our patients are clearly demonstrating notable decreases in their use of conventional medications. The clinical data clearly show signs of improvement in a number of different domains, and we're generally seeing improved performance on measures of executive function and pretty stable memory performance over time. Remember that recreational cannabis use is often associated with decrements. The studies using diffusion tensor imaging are demonstrating increased white matter coherence, so improved white matter fiber tract organization and coherence between baseline 3 and 6 months, suggesting a structural brain change may be related to use. And these patterns of clinical and cognitive and structural and functional brain changes are not demonstrated in the same ways in our treatment as usual folks. When we look at medical cannabis patients and assess whether or not they meet criteria for problematic use or there are signs of problematic use, we don't see any evidence of that either. So taken together, data suggests that medical cannabis is potentially a safe alternative or adjunctive treatment for at least some patients, absolutely. I'm going to move to clinical trials. I just want to say one quick thing. I took out a bunch of slides in the interest of time. It's absolutely an option for a number of patients, no question. There are also things to keep in mind, like potential drug-drug interactions, because cannabinoids wreak havoc on the cytochrome P450 enzyme system. And if you're using products that are edibles or designed to be consumed, you have to be careful about what else is on board and your own genetic makeup. So I mentioned that we also do clinical trials. I produce and make study products a number of different ways. I had to start with the NIDA drug study or the drug supply program. We now have some industry partners. We work with chemists with cannabis experience, but it's basically how I take something that looks like that sludge and come up with something that patients will actually take, like that clear stuff that's in the dropper. It's not as easy as people probably think it is. And NIDA, although they've expanded their drug supply program exponentially, they don't have anything close to what you see in dispensaries or points of sale. They just don't. And so that's important. I also think it's incredibly important to study real-world products that people are actually using. So this study was the very first open-label to double-blind, whole-plant, full-spectrum product designed for use or application in patients with moderate to severe anxiety. It's a 4-week study. It's a sublingual administration. It's about 10 mg per mil of CBD about 0.24 to 0.27 mgs of THC per mil, so pretty low, pretty low. And that's a cannabis-based product, not hemp. And it's a full spectrum, obviously, so we have other cannabinoids. And what do we see? We just published this, actually, also this month. We see a 79.9, so just call it an 80% decrease between baseline and 4 weeks of treatment on the Beck Anxiety Inventory, 70% decrease in something called the OASIS, or the Overall Anxiety Severity and Impairment Scale, and a 82% change in Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale. So both self-report and examiner-driven scales demonstrate significant reductions in anxiety in these patients from baseline over the 4 weeks of treatment. We also see significant improvements on ratings of mood. Remember the Beck Depression Inventory from our from our observational study? Same kind of thing here, 78% decrease. That's pretty striking. Over almost 64% decrease from baseline to 4 weeks of treatment on the profile of mood state, total mood disturbance. So pretty stunning. We also saw improvements on measures of sleep and quality of life, and the cognitive data, perhaps not surprisingly, looks suspiciously similar as the data I showed you from the observational study. Very important, no significant adverse events were reported, and not one patient ever reported feeling intoxicated or impaired at any point. Interestingly, at the end of 4 weeks, half the sample tested positive for THC. So, and I also, the reason I make that point is, I mentioned it was like 0.22, 0.24 to 0.27. That's 1/10 of the allowable amount by law. So imagine, right? You get 0.3% THC by weight to be able to call it hemp. This is 0.24 mgs per mil. So that's 0.02. Like that's a magnitude of difference. So we have lots of other ongoing studies, including longitudinal studies of older adults using opioids for chronic pain, a quasi-clinical trial of veterans and highly underserved population using a commercially available product that is either added to their current cannabis regimen or for people who are just starting use. We have a number of ongoing clinical trials for anxiety, and we have some pending clinical trials that are poised to start actually at the end of this month. Patients with bipolar disorder, actually that study will kick off at McLean at the end of this month, and patients who have glioblastoma, we're looking at anxiety and pain as primary outcome variables, and as secondary outcome variables, we're looking at tumor regression. So those are ultra-high compounds. They contain a number of constituents, but it's actually an ultra-high CBD-containing compound. Sleep is in preparation, and I have an IND for pain. So there's a lot going on. We have something called WIM, or the Women's Health Initiative at Mind, which is designed to address women's health and disorders that disproportionately or exclusively impact women, as well as some transgender and non-binary folks, things like endometriosis, fibromyalgia, etc. So my take-home points for you today. Cannabis is complex. It isn't one thing. It's not one thing. Different products confer different effects, so buyers, be aware. Not beware. You should always beware, but be aware. Ask questions. What's in the product? Show us a certificate of analysis. Give me something. We know perfectly well that, unfortunately, label claims are not exactly always correct. Modes of use impact onset and duration of effects. I didn't go into that here, but if anybody wants to talk about it, there's a huge difference between smoking or vaping, where you feel an effect or rise time in minutes, and the duration of effect versus ingestion, right? Where we don't get an effect until we actually digest it, 90 minutes up to 3 hours, and then we have a pass through the liver where, again, delta-9 is actually converted to something called 11-hydroxy, which is more intoxicating. It's the gift that keeps on giving if you take too much. You won't die, but you might wish you would die. So, can't shut down the brainstem, but yeah. Using cannabis for medical purposes does not mean you need to be high. I get that a lot. I don't want to be high, though. That's the problem. Well, it's not a problem. And factors like age, family history, medication use, and genetic profile. Not just genetic profile in terms of your own family history, but your own metabolism in terms of these different factors. Are you a fast or slow metabolizer of THC? It makes a huge difference. One size does not fit all when it comes to cannabis. And I have to say, I think I really did hear this from you guys. You should let science, not stigma, right, guide decision-making and best practices. That part's mine, but science over stigma, right? Policy has outpaced science. We're all playing catch-up. But let the science guide you in your decision-making, not the rhetoric. We know that THC has historically been associated with the decrements that have been reported with regard to cognitive and clinical outcomes, predominantly in those who are pretty vulnerable. That's important to keep in mind because medical cannabis patients clearly demonstrate some improvements in a number of areas. These may be related to things that are different, like their product selection, that confer different constituent profiles within the products. Later onset of use, so your brain is not neurodevelopmentally vulnerable. Primary symptom alleviation, when your symptoms are addressed, you actually feel better, and you don't feel as anxious or sad potentially, and you certainly can think more clearly. Reduced conventional medication use. We've all had the experience of, maybe not of you personally, but you've all probably heard stories of people saying, "Oh, I took X last night to sleep and I feel so foggy-headed." Or a variety of other factors. All of these things may make a difference. And real-world data from longitudinal studies of patients are critical, as are additional clinical trials assessing multiple product types and modes of use. We need to assess a bunch of different domains and look at the impact of specific cannabinoids when used alone and in conjunction with other compounds. Without vision, we can't move forward, so I always remind people you gotta think outside the box. The cannabis space is unusual, and it's a constantly shifting landscape. What is true today and legal today may or may not be tomorrow, or I think you get the point. So with that, I would stop. I don't know if you have any questions, but I would tell you I could not do this work without this ridiculous, unbelievably dedicated team that I have. I think I see one of my team here. I won't call her out, but she's here. Anyway, they are as dedicated to our patients as I am, and it doesn't happen easily. And there are a lot of a lot of hurdles to sort of deal with when you're dealing with cannabis, unfortunately. It shouldn't be that way. And as Mike said, we're trying very hard to slowly but surely change the conversation and the narrative and ultimately the landscape. And with that, I would thank you for your time. Thank you so much for flying MCR Labs today, and we appreciate your business. Please be sure to sign up for our rewards card on your way out of the airplane. Anybody? Oh, there really are. Can I take questions? Nobody gave me any instructions. I'm just kidding. Can I take questions? Is that okay? You saw up there. NM. Oh. It's good that you started with the easiest one, right? Hey, can you explain a structural brain change after exposure to, I don't know, a various combination of cannabinoids and other constituents over time that people choose themselves and use in various ways? That's easy. So one of the things that actually vexed me was the only thing I could find in the literature, and really all kidding aside, is that patients with psychotic disorders who had not actually had relief, who finally had something that worked, demonstrated a structural brain change in terms of higher white matter fiber tract integrity after 1 month of treatment, which is interesting. So I wonder if it's amelioration of symptoms that does it. I don't know. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that each of these cannabinoids executes their effects or exert their effects through different mechanisms. They don't all, look, CBD doesn't exert effects through CB1 or CB2 receptors primarily, right? So it's important to keep those things in mind. And I think as we delve more deeply into it, we'll have a better understanding. One of the things we're trying to do is take a very close look at endogenous endocannabinoids and how that changes over time and how different things within the brain in terms of brain metabolite ratios also change. So my answer is it could be a number of things, but stay tuned. I hope we can address it more specifically. Yeah. Sure. Sure. I think it's a great question, and so many people are invested in this space because of the numbers of individuals who are affected, and the pandemic, again, did not make this better. It's like anxiety, right? Rates of anxiety went through the roof. Opioid use went through the roof. As we get more stressed as a society. Oh, and by the way, has anybody noticed what I call the global destabilization we're all experiencing? So times are tough, and people are stressed and anxious and want something. I think that medical cannabis or cannabis used as substitution or adjunctive therapy has huge potential. I think different combinations are likely going to be required depending on the type of pain. So that's the big thing. A lot of patients will report that using opioids makes them not care that they have pain. They still have pain, which I always think is interesting. I'd rather see the actual symptom addressed than that. And so the question then becomes, how does one more efficaciously, address the actual pain? And I think it's going to be a combination of efforts. It's very encouraging that fewer prescriptions are written for opioids and fewer opioid deaths are reported in states with legalized medical cannabis programs. That tells us something, right? Patients don't typically want to stay on opioids. And that older adult study that we have, where patients are using, to get into the study, you have to be using opioids for chronic pain or benzodiazepines. And very often they're looking to add medical cannabis to reduce or eliminate their use of opioids. So I think we'll know more over time, and I think the older population will likely look a little different from the younger population. But I think there's a huge amount of promise here. On the West Coast, there's lots of clinics that are taking the approach of, hey, let's take people off acutely, and let's hit them with very high THC products over a short period of time and see what happens. There are all sorts of ethical and medical concerns with that approach when done outside of an infrastructure that might be able to support that should something go awry. So I think there's a lot to learn from all the different sort of approaches that people are taking, if that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. Non-cancer pain, cancer pain, musculoskeletal pain, fibromyalgia, like neuropathic pain. These are very different, right? So, yeah. 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 So route of administration is always going to change the onset of effect and the duration of effect first and foremost. I think whole plant full spectrum products where you have these other, quote, unsung heroes, forgive the expression, the minor cannabinoids that are actually more likely to show a change over time than our two main players. They're just less known, right? It's sort of like your support staff in your restaurant who are running the show, but you're paying attention to the maitre d' and whatever. So I think there's a lot to be very excited about in that realm, and it's not at all surprising that people use very concentrated products. And I think there's a whole lot more to the equation than just THC and CBD. I mean, big time. So, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is actually one study in the country that's looking specifically at change over time for individuals who are maintained with gabapentin. And to your point, it's one of those things that people often report they only have very limited symptom relief from, but they take it anyway because it's better than nothing. So how does that look if you add X, Y, or Z? The problem is that it's not, when you have these studies, you want to look at a range of things that are potentially added, either as adjunctive or substitution therapies. So we haven't entered into that realm. A lot of our patients are on things like gabapentin when they begin, our chronic pain patients. So we chart that over time, but to say that it's a study designed specifically to look at that would not be accurate. So we haven't yet, but I think there is one group that's doing that. So it's a great question. Yeah, in the back. Whole plant. In terms of, so let me say this. So the first studies were designed and only able to be completed using NIDA source product because at that time the DEA had not given there were no other sources. I don't know if everybody in this room knows that for the majority of my lifetime, the only source of cannabis or cannabinoids to be used for clinical trials comes from the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. And as I mentioned, in the very, very old days, they had very limited flower-based products only of very specific, quote, potencies. And let's just use potency. I know it's not really true. I'm pointing at my pal here, Mike Casinos. Potency, we're just going to use proxy THC content as potency, right? So there were very specific parameters and very specific ranges, and they would ship them to us in these rather unceremonious Christmas cookie tins. Yeah, that was crazy. And that's basically what they had. Now, they've expanded their platform, again, quite a bit, but 98%, 99% of what they have is still flower product. And that's actually not where I spend the majority of my time creating study products. Most of our studies are designed to use a sublingual administration. So in terms of pre-IND meetings and NIDA-sourced product, that isn't really an issue, if that makes sense. At NIDA? Oh, at FDA. It actually depends on the indication, believe it or not. So you're assigned to different groups depending on the indication and population under study. So the glioblastoma trial is wholly different from the Alzheimer's trials, wholly different from our chronic patients with moderate to severe anxiety who are otherwise healthy. All different teams, and they've all required different things. And as time has marched on, they're asking for different levels of detail. So I now have, I think, the most comprehensive spreadsheet I've ever had for anything, for drug-drug interactions in terms of cytochrome P450 enzymes, trade names, generic names for different compounds and potential interactions, strong inducer, strong inhibitor, blah, blah, blah. So it really depends on the population and the source of product, so. Individualized, sorry. Yeah, so we wouldn't be doing that in particular, although we do PK/PD studies of our study products, but I think it's more to the point of not enrolling individuals who are on certain types of medications because it's contraindicated. For example, fun fact, if you're taking a blood thinner, CBD is not your friend. I repeat, CBD is not your friend. You have to be really mindful. You can inadvertently increase or decrease the amount of other drugs on board is basically the take home. You've all heard this story, oh, no grapefruit juice because I'm taking this. It's the same thing, same exact thing. So we don't deal with that at that level necessarily for each person, but to exclude potentially vulnerable patients. So in early days of clinical trials, the other thing you want to be mindful of is you don't want to enroll someone where there's a potential contraindication for your study drug. If you can avoid that, you should. No matter how desperate you are for patients, don't do that. So, yeah. You mean on the QDIT, you mean? Would you like me to explain why that is? Is that what you're going to ask me? It's a great question. Good eyes and good for you. So one of the things that people and patients often tell us is that because medical cannabis is not covered by insurance and is remarkably expensive and often difficult for them to get and have consistent sourced product over time, they'd love to get away with, quote, using less. And if the interesting thing that I think is really something, remember, Dennis, we talked about this, and yeah, Marion, they're actually using less over time. Suggesting that the endocannabinoid system actually can be tweaked and respond. So I think that's the reason. They don't generally report deleterious functioning or difficulty with function. That's the thing. But to be brutally honest, the measure, I mean, I'm glad we published this. I think it's great because there was nothing, but the metric is wrong. The metric is not valid for medical cannabis patients. Any metric that basically assigns a high number for using something every day, when patients say, I use my medicine every day, that's not valid. You gotta come up with something else, right? So, but I think that's the reason, because we have discussions with patients about it. Where can I get something like this but cheaper? Because I'm paying out of pocket, which, you can understand, and I can't fly with it. Now I worry about this and I worry about that. So I think that's probably the reason, but it's another really good thing to keep in mind. And it's the reason we watch for potential misuse or issues related to use. It's not for everybody, and it's not for everybody across the lifespan at each point. Right? So, yeah.
Did I understand correctly
Oh.
when you were talking about cognitive decline between non-users, early onset users, and late
Late
onset
onset
and
controls.
control was not significant?
In the majority of cases, that was true. So we looked at each of the individual neurocognitive measures separately And again, when you look at cannabis users versus controls, you see differences. But when you split the cannabis users into those with early and late onset, the differences in the first between group distinction is almost exclusively driven by the early onset folks. It's not, I guess if you think of it logically, when you have this vulnerable system, it's not surprising, right? But it's a earlier age of onset as well as higher frequency and magnitude of use. So, sure. Yeah. Here, here. Here, here. Yes. Yeah. So people try to, first of all, yay, and yes, I completely agree with you. It's the most maddening thing on the planet, which is why out of the box we describe exactly what we mean. When we say heavy chronic use, what do we mean? What do we mean? What's heavy versus light? So for our studies, long ago and far away, to be considered a chronic heavy cannabis user, you had to use 5 of the last 7 days, be positive in terms of urinary cannabinoids, blah, 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 all this stuff. Do you know that one of the other groups, I will not name names, but who happens to be in my same system, not on my hill, but in my same system, I did a study of light versus heavy. Their light use was, I think, 3 or 3.5 days. Wait a minute, how can that be? You know what I'm saying? So the lexicon in terms of researchers is not uniform. That's a problem, and it's frustrating for the readers. I completely agree with you. So people have tried in other countries to use lots of different equivalent methods, and here, people try to use like joints per day. That's crazy. Who says your joint is the same as my joint or their? Like that's nuts, right? The same is true of and anything else. So we try to actually use quantifiable measures like milligrams, because at least it's comparable across product types. You can do a calculation, but I completely agree with you. Heavy versus light use, chronic versus intermittent, joints per day. And by the way, when we get to the concentrate space, what are we talking about? So someone who dabs twice a day but is exposed to this versus this, how is that the same? And I tried very hard to do a study, not once but twice, of concentrate users versus just conventional flower users, because my feeling was, especially in the neurodevelopmentally vulnerable stage, you probably see some differences in people who are using super high concentrated products during that vulnerable period versus those who weren't. Apparently it was not that compelling, so I have yet to answer the question. We will answer it at some point, but it's a great thing, and I'm sorry, I share your frustration. So, yeah. So patients were instructed to self-administer 1 ml 3 times a day. So everybody takes it on their own. They have a meter dropper. They take 1 ml. They hold it under their tongue, blah, blah, blah. But to your point, we also weigh bottles. See, where's Dennis? Dennis, this is why we wait. This is somebody from my lab. Everybody wave and say thank you, because she's amazing. This is why we weigh bottles on the way out and on the way in, because not every, everybody has the same instruction. But we had some people, the average use was like 3.5 mils instead of 3. So people were, taking a little bit more than they should. And we actually did correlations. Remember I mentioned that we actually looked at THC status at the end? We were just curious. And we had it all confirmed with GCMS. There was no relationship between people who were using more product and THC positive status. So it wasn't a function of taking more and just turning positive. It wasn't a function of BMI either. It looks like it's a function of a number of things, including specifically creatinine level. But anyway. I think your endocannabinoid tone, that is the natural distribution of how many, your endocannabinoid system, how much of, let's say, anandamide or 2-AG, the two primary endocannabinoids that we think of, or even quasi-endocannabinoids, I think that makes a huge difference. I think your genetic makeup makes a huge difference. I think what else you have on board and all sorts of other things make a difference. In a clinical trial, everybody has to get the same dose, typically, or you do an escalating dose depending on what the questions are. In our AD study, we allow people to increase if they don't hit a certain clinical milestone at a certain point. You know, if you don't show improvement as defined by this, we bump up to that. But to your point, everybody is different, and we have to set, you know, sort of, again, we're studying this study product. And so it had to be this one study product for everybody. Do I think everybody processes, basically, and has the same effect from the same exposure? No, I do not. No, I do not. I think for people who are ultra slow metabolizers of THC and very sensitive, 0.24 mg per mil may already be like on the high side, let alone 5 mg per mil or 10 mg per mil. For other people who are ultra fast metabolizers, they don't even notice 5 mg per mil. You know what I mean? So I think it's all different. So we do the best we can, which is why I think it's important to be able to sample people's actual endocannabinoid profile. It's harder to do than you think, but yeah. Anybody? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure how we'll be able to model that because so far we haven't had people stop using. So these are medical cannabis patients who, no, we haven't. No, I mean, they're in, and actually the reason that we keep extending, I started this study is supposed to be 1 year, and I was laughed off the planet. They basically said, good luck getting 3 months or 6 months. Patients not only want to stay at 1 month, at 1 year, they want to stay for 2 years. Now, right, 3 years. They're happy to stay. Medical cannabis patients are very happy to tell you about their experiences, what's good, what's not good. People who use cannabis in general, recreational consumers, the best group of people I've ever worked with in terms of getting feedback, real world information. Let me tell you this, it's the best in terms of collecting data. But to your point, what we'd have to do is assess those who have discontinued their use. We do follow up the people who stop using medical cannabis, but they're very few and far between so far. I'm not even sure I could count on one hand how many. We haven't had too many people stop, but we do follow those folks up. That's the reason for also looking at treatment as usual who convert the other way. They go from no cannabis to using cannabis. Because the question is, you know, what will you see over time? And are any benefits sustained, you know, in the absence? We have had some people cross over from clinical trials into using commercially available products where there's an appreciable gap in time. So my study's over, no more study product, and it's 3 weeks before they get a commercially available product shipped to them. We certainly keep track of that data, if that's helpful. But in terms of brain imaging, that's a little bit more complicated. But it'll be fascinating to watch it over time. So, anybody else? Yeah. There's very little standardization even in things like an RSO, just so you know. They vary, region to region, product type by product type, and I think our everyday bud tenders or patient care advocates have become the de facto pharmacists of you know, dispensaries, and they're asked and tasked with what seem to be impossible questions. I think it would be great to actually give folks some real training and to allow them to understand the differences that they might, you know, want to focus on for some people. For some folks, there are certain products that they should never really use. In terms of, you know, well, we have this product that's a standard. We don't really have those yet. Not so much. I mean, when we think about what that means, I think there's a lot to take into consideration for individuals. Again, their own liability, their own experiences previously, if they've had any with cannabis, their use of alcohol or other prescriptions, their genetic liability, their family history. People with a really strong family history in certain areas, we probably want to be mindful of certain products. But to your point, I think that a lot of us in this room think that there should be mandatory education. Not to put a burden on them, but to arm them with the right types of information. Everybody wants to be helpful here. Nobody's intentionally trying to mislead or to not provide a best case, set of data for decision making. But there's a huge disconnect to your point, and I wish there weren't. Yeah. Oh. Mm-hmm. So I think you're getting to something that we consider along the lines of expectancy. So we also measure expectancy at baseline and whether or not, you've probably read, there's a fair amount these days in the literature about placebo effects. So if you think you're going to get better and you've gone through the pain and suffering and expense of getting a product, by God, you're going to feel better. Isn't that amazing? That's why we like open label studies to a point to see if there's a signal, but then you have to prove it with a double-blind trial. To your point, I think that goes to expectancy and what you think you're going to, quote, experience. Interestingly, when we did our last expectancy analysis, people with lower levels of positive expectancy actually did better. So it's sort of counterintuitive. But, I'm a big believer in, again, trying to address the things that we know we can control and trying to find ways to help clarify as opposed to, good luck telling them not to market something this way or only that way, right, for these populations. Wouldn't work. So anybody else? I think I know you have this huge number of very exciting presentations awaiting you outside these doors. So yes, you right there. Yes. So I don't have difficulty finding. What I have are patients who are continuing to live lives and feel satisfied with their treatment. In terms of, quote, addiction, so in the old days, and again, Mike's right, I've been at this a long time, many, many decades at this point, but I used to run the clinical and diagnostic assessment group, and I'll tell you, in the old days when we looked at abuse versus dependence or addiction, we now have different nomenclature. We talk about substance use disorders, and we talk about like cannabis use disorders. You have to have X number, and for mild, moderate, or severe. We don't really see that too much in this population, mostly because we don't see impairment in a number of areas like occupation or social. People aren't using to the exclusion of this, or this. So I think that's important. I don't think it's a question, especially when we look at the distribution of intoxicating, so to speak, to non-intoxicating of constituents that they're being exposed to, right? Here, the first big cut is THC and CBD. They're getting exposed to exponentially more CBD than THC. CBD is not rewarding to the brain. THC is, right? So I don't necessarily think that's why. I think that undoubtedly there will be reasons that people stop using. Most often we hear it's really expensive, and getting a consistent product, that's the big one. I love this product, it was great, and now I can't get it anymore. Or this was labeled this way before, and it says the same thing, but it's not at all the same product, which we've all had terrible, terrible stories about. So does that answer your question? I haven't seen it yet. We're staying tuned, though. We're staying vigilant. Anybody else? No? Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. And have fun. You have good swag. You have those nice big mugs, so that's really pretty cool.